Hey guys, it's Whitney Garner here. I'm an instructor with Manhattan GMAT, and it is my pleasure to come and celebrate with GMAT Club for their millionth post. And in honor of a millionth post, why not start off with something new, some integrated reasoning. So the plan today, talk about integrated reasoning, talk about some speed strategies, put it all together, and come up with what we'll do on test day so that we don't burn ourselves out before the sections that actually do matter, the quant and verbal. I want to just start with basic little facts, right? Some basic facts that you may feel pretty comfortable with. So let's just sort of rip through these so that we can start getting to the good stuff, the questions, right? So the quick facts, for those of you that started studying for the GMAT prior to June 5th, 2012, you will remember the old format. A couple of essays up front, didn't really matter so much, so you kind of spent an hour doing your best to write something relatively interesting and making sure that the height of your seat worked and that your monitor was, the right brightness and that your mouse worked and that your pen would work. And so it was a nice little warm up. Right? You had an whole hour to just kind of get comfortable in the test center. And then, right, after the essay is when you got to start on the section that actually mattered. Right? And this was it. This was the test for quite some time. And we got two scores. Right? We got an essay score that was from 0 to 6 in half-point increments, so like 0, 0.5, 1, 1.5. And then we got the score that everybody just would wait for. Wait until that screen, oh, what's my score? What's my score? And so we had something between 2 to 800 in 10-point increments, right? And we all want those 710, 720, 730. Oh, what's my score? Right? Well, things have changed. So unfortunately, the test has grown up a little bit. And so since June 5th, we've had some things alter. Now the stuff that matters, the where's my score, that's still the same. So that 2 to 800 that you wait at the end of the test to click show me my scores, it's still going to be there. So those haven't gone anywhere. The part that we care about, the business schools care about, that score has stayed the exact same. It's still 2 to 800. And in fact, one of our essays has stayed the exact same. Now we just know which one it's going to be. Right? It used to be that we didn't know which essay was going to come first. Now, not only do we know which one's coming first, because there's only one, we know exactly which one it's going to be. It'll be the argument essay. And in fact, most people tended to do much better on the argument essay, so it's great that that's the one that we get to keep. So it's kind of like a critical reasoning exercise, just a little bit longer. So we're going to work on that argument essay. It's going to have the exact same score as it did before, 0 to 6. So what is all the hubbub? What's new? Well, it's this little 30-minute section called IR, Integrated Reasoning. And it's a little 30-minute section that's built up of 12 little questions. Now those 12 questions have multiple parts within them, and we only have 30 minutes to complete them, so it's going to be a little hectic. But there are some things that should make us feel a little bit better about IR. So let's do that. Let's kind of go for our IR rundown. Right? In my mind, there are some definite negatives to IR. Right? The test is already stressful. Trying to get this, what's my score, is already a really stressful thing, and it takes up a lot of our time studying. And so what in the world? I do not want to meet some new section that I have to start learning. Right? More questions, more stuff to do. This is unfair, right? I've already got enough on my plate. I've got work and I've got a life, or I wanted to have a life, and now the GMAT's taking all of it. And now they even want more. Silly IR. So yeah, it is a new section to learn, but I promise it's not going to be quite as new as it might appear. Now, one honest to goodness annoyance with IR is its placement on the test. Right? IR shows up early. And why is that a problem? Well, it's taking fresh energy away from the sections that we do care about. We used to have an hour up front to just kind of relax, right? Test the height of your chair, but not anymore. We only have 30 minutes to do that now. Now, half an hour has to be spent on this bizarro IR section where apparently it's going to be super fast-paced with lots of multi-part questions, and oh my goodness, right? It's going to be downright energy intensive. It's going to be zapping our energy if we let it. So part of the thing I want you to think about, not only while we're in our workshop today, but also while you're studying for IR in general, is to really keep your eyes on the prize. Remember the important part. The important part of your whole cat right? That whole computer adaptive test is going to be this piece. That's what really matters. So we want to be very careful, and we want to learn just enough about IR so that we can do an okay job and not let it get us stressed out for everything else that's to come. So some good news then, right? Well, it's a new section for us to learn, to take, but the good news is it's a new section for schools to try and interpret. Why is that good news for us? Because they don't know how to interpret it. And they're not going to for a little while. Right? There's no telling what these scores mean. What does it mean that you're a 6? What does it mean that you're a 4? Right? They're 1-point increments. That's pretty big slice and dices, right? So how do I have any idea what any of this stuff means? And if I'm a business school, I don't even know what kind of predictive power this portion of the test has until I have a whole bunch of students who've taken the IR join the ranks of my business school. And since the IR section's only been out for a few months, I'm not going to have that. And I'm not going to have that for a little while. So while we may be nervous that it's new, we should also be reassured that it's new because its impact is really unknown. Right? And not just unknown for us, but unknown for the people who are trying to make decisions based on it. So they're not going to be able to make decisions for a little while. So we can breathe easy. We just want to try and do okay, right? We don't need some 99th percentile IR score. We just need good enough. What else? Well, you don't actually have to study new stuff. We don't have to worry that, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to buy even more books. I thought it was bad enough that I had to learn geometry again. And I thought it was bad enough that I'm still having to sit here and drill exponent rules because I haven't seen exponents since I was in high school. Right? If you feel that way, I am totally with you. But guess what? All the stuff that you're studying for this part, the part that we care about, pours right over into IR. Right? So it is going to have some slightly different focus. Right? It's going to move us in a little bit of a different way here and there, but we're going to be using the same basic skill set. We're going to be using much of the same quantitative work that we've been studying and much of the same verbal work, particularly things like critical reasoning and reading comprehension. And so good news, if you're like me and don't want to do a bunch of sentence correction, maybe you'll like IR. There's not grammar. Yay. Maybe I should add that to the smiley face list. No grammar. So we've got this test that sure it's new, but we're already really preparing for it. And the score is separate. Right? That's actually nice. I don't have to worry that this score is going to impact the thing that I know I care about. Now, it makes things a little bit harder, at least down the road, because, once IR does get important, if it does, then there's not going to be any way to hide that score, right? By maybe knocking it out of the park with my standard quant and verbal scores. But again, if you're going to be taking this section anywhere at least in 2012 and doing any applying through 2013, you're not going to need to be so worried about IR. Right? Let the next generations of GMAT takers worry about IR. Your job right now is just to do an okay job and start setting percentiles for this question. Okay, so really the kind of big takeaway, it's a minor change. I know it feels like a big deal, but after today, I really want you to feel a lot more confident, a lot more prepared, and ready to maybe make some good strategies, follow some decent ideas as you move through your IR section. All right, so a couple other little details, right? What is this IR section all about? Well, these new question formats are really the big deal. We're going to spend a little time there looking at what these question formats actually look like and how to interact with them. Right? Most of our time is going to be spent with, hey, in these question formats, how can I save some time? How can I move quickly? And how can I make smart decisions about the questions I go on? But we're still going to have to learn these weird things like sorting data tables. But wait a minute, I have Excel. I've sorted tables before. You told me this was new. Well, it's not new to you. It's just new to the GMAT. So you're going to be fine. You will see a lot of stuff that you recognize. You just might not have been prepared to see it in the GMAT. So maybe you'll sort some data. Maybe you'll analyze some graphs. No big deal. You analyze graphs all the time. Again, it may not be new to you. It's just new to the GMAT. What else? Well, you are going to have to deal with something a little nasty. And this is probably, in my mind, one of my least favorite parts of the IR section. And it's the fact that a question on the IR isn't really just one question. It's often layered questions, right? Or paired questions where you don't just fill in one blank, you fill in two, or you answer in two columns or in multiple rows. Right? So we'll have to adventure through some of these new multi-parts. We're also going to have to keep an eye on the new focus, right? As it sort of name indicates, it's integrated, right? So it's going to demand from us an integrated understanding. That means that they're going to want to use quant and verbal together. Now, the questions are still going to feel very quant-like or very verbal-like. Right? As you work on one, you'll probably say to yourself, I feel like I did a lot more verbal here. Or I feel like I did a lot more quant here. Or if anything, I feel like I was just doing real-world analysis. But when you are doing problems, what it means when they say integrated is that you're going to do quant questions and they'll be wordy. So if you haven't brushed up on your word problems, maybe spend a little bit of extra time there. It'll help you out on the GMAT anyways. If you're doing verbal questions, it's very likely that they'll be asking you to do lots of computations. So if you get really nervous by reading comp passages or critical reasoning questions that have lots of numbers in them, or that may require you to do some plugging and chugging, well, maybe practice some extra ones of those, because there's a very good chance you'll see things like that on the IR section. Another thing to think about, well, I sort of alluded to it, but 12 questions, 30 minutes, that actually doesn't seem so bad, right? That's 2.5 minutes a question. That's actually longer than we get on the quant portion of the test. So why am I sitting here saying, oh, you're going to have to move at a faster pace? Well, this 2.5 minutes isn't going to just be for one question. Don't forget, they're multi-part. So it may be one question, right? It looks like one question all together, packing it up on the screen, but you may actually have 3 questions to answer within it, right? Or 2 blanks to fill in. So be prepared. It's not 2.5 minutes for one question. It may be 2.5 minutes for 2 or 3 questions. So pacing is going to be very important. Very, very important. Some good news, it's not adaptive. So pacing, we don't have to be so worried about dumping questions and how that might screw up our trajectory like it would on the GMAT. But we can't bounce around. So they have restricted us to moving in a forward direction, just like the rest of the test. So as we're making decisions, should I work on this problem? Should I skip this problem? We can't go bouncing around to try and play to our strengths. We're going to have a clear idea of what we believe our strengths are going in. And even more importantly, what we believe our weaknesses are so that we can minimize those by getting rid of those questions. Okay, last but not least, I've got another little bit of good news. And it's the fact that you actually get a new tool. And so this is going to be a big help. It's the on-screen calculator. You can click, it'll pop up, you can use it. Yes, it's extraordinarily basic, but it's better than nothing. Now, nothing is what you're going to return to after the IR section. So don't get too accustomed to using this calculator. As you move back to the rest of the test, they take the calculator away. So GMAT Quant, as we know it, still is calculator free. But in IR, we're going to have this functionality available to us, and we're going to need it because the numbers that we'll be seeing are probably going to be pretty ugly. And there are definitely going to be computations that will require the use of a calculator. But I want you to think about using your calculator judiciously, right? Because I don't necessarily want to do massive computations even if I have a calculator. Right? So I don't really want to find the average of 45 numbers. I mean, I can, but I certainly don't think that it's ideal. And I don't want to do it in 2.5 minutes or well under, because I still have to leave time to read the question. And I don't want to have to do it with no sort of recall of what was typed before. So imagine you're typing 40-some numbers and you make a keystroke error. Well, now it's a mess. So we're going to think about how to use this calculator efficiently. We're not going to necessarily do every single calculation out. We're always going to be looking for shortcuts. All right, so that's about it. Right, so we've got the big quick facts. Now, let's go take a look at the actual question types. All right, so it's time for the prompts. And I don't know if you've noticed this yet, but the GMAT really just loves to give everything a fancy name. And so, yet another thing, they call these things prompts. And I guess it sort of makes sense because each question kind of has a couple of parts. Sort of like a data sufficiency problem, where the prompt is the information at the beginning. And then you'll have some questions to ask about it. Right? So the prompts are divided into 4 types. Okay? So we'll start with the one that most people tend to dislike, which actually turns out to be one of my favorites, the multi-source reasoning. So again, fancy name for a thing with tabs at the top. So multi-source reasoning, or the MSRs, as I'm going to call them because I'm very, very lazy with my speech, the MSRs are typically 2 or 3 tab documents. They may contain reading comprehension passages, they might have tables embedded in them, they may have graphs, they may have email chains, who knows? They get all sorts of information, and they could spread across 2 or even 3 tabs. Okay? We are going to have the capability of clicking on these tabs so that we can see the various information that's available. Now, notice that as I'm clicking on these things, I don't get the opportunity to see them all at the same time. So that's a little bit of an added headache that I'm bouncing around trying to remember, well, what was that complicated word, isotope ratio mass spectrometry that I saw on this one? And then I click on artifacts or I click on budget, and now I've forgotten all of those fancy big words that I learned on an earlier tab. So we're going to have to try, before we move into the questions, and at least build a nice understanding of how the tabs interact. We're going to have to continuously refer to them as we answer questions, but at least we should understand where the connections might lie. All right, so if this is the prompt, right, one set of multi-source reasoning questions, so a single set, actually includes 3 questions. Now, what do those 3 questions look like? Well, the typical look for these is to have 2 of these weird either or type questions. So you're going to choose a single answer for each row. So they'll ask a question, something about this 2 or 3 tab document, and then we'll have to answer that question about 3 different things, and we'll have to answer it in one of 2 ways. And it may be yes or no. It may be yes or maybe, or it may be would explain, would not explain. There are going to be these 2 questions, and we can only ever say one for each row, and it's going to be our job to pick. Now, I feel like the bearer of just like infinite bad news today, so please don't shoot the messenger. I promise it'll get better. Right? I'm just giving you all the bad news up front so that we can move on to the good stuff later. For each one of these questions, so you'll have 2 of them, each time you see one, it's an all or nothing. Right? There's no partial credit. So you must get all 3 rows correct in order to be able to get full credit for that question, or to get any credit for that question. So when we work on multi-part questions, we really want to think about the likelihood of getting all 3 parts right. And if a problem is something that we're not so sure we could accomplish all 3 parts, then we shouldn't really bother with any of the parts, right? So don't spend your time working diligently on 2 lines when you know for a fact that you have no idea how to find the answer for the 3rd one. So sometimes an idea, and it might take a little bit of time, but if you kind of have real understanding of your personal strengths and weaknesses, maybe you scan the questions, and that'll help you understand, oh, that one looks really terrible. I don't even understand what it's asking. The other question type that'll follow these MSRs, so that to round out this 3-pack, are just old-fashioned multiple choice. So the good news here is this is just a single question. You just answer this one. It's just a plain old multiple choice that we're totally good and accustomed to. And 5 choices, I pick the one that answers the question. And if I get that right, I get full credit. Just like a normal GMAT question. Sadly, we're probably only going to see one of those because we only get one MSR set. So during your test, you should really only ever see one of these tabbed prompts. Okay, so if this is the MSR, then what's next? Well, I'm doing them in order of my favorite. So MSR is one of my favorites because I kind of think I like the little tabbing along. I think it's sort of fun. So this is one of those weird questions where you're going to be tabbing things and answering things in weird new ways. The next question, or the next prompt type rather, isn't so much about clicking on a bunch of stuff. It's going to be static. And these will be the graphics. Your job just to interpret a given graph. They might be histograms. They might be bar charts. They might be pie charts. They might be distributions. They might be timelines, right? There's all sorts of graphs out there in the world, and they can choose from any of those to put on the test. And they may or may not offer you some text. There's usually going to be a title. They'll almost always give you axes information as well as some headings. So everything should be there to help you understand the graph. You shouldn't need anything that isn't encapsulated here. Now, to answer these graphs, you'll have only one question. So that's good. Each graph you see, you'll only answer a single question. Okay? So each question is going to be a fill-in-the-blank question with two parts. That means you'll have two blanks to fill in. So you'll read the little sentence, and then you'll click and look at what the different choices are to sort of fill in that blank. So not too bad. So you'll have three graphs with their accompanying fill-in-the-blank questions. And I really like graphs. I think they're a lot of fun. Now again, it's multi-part. So what does multi-part mean? Oh, it means no partial credit. It means that I have to get both of these blanks correct in order to get the credit for the problem. So there's only one multiple choice question. So everything else is multi-part. So everything else, I'm stuck with this stupid partial credit business hanging over my head. So let's just go ahead and get used to it. My next, so I guess third favorite of the 4 prompts is going to be the table. Now, I love tables because tables pretty much always look like tables. Right? With all of the different ways that a graph can be displayed, a table is pretty much always a table. And we're going to get a little bit of sorting capability. So it's better than just staring at some static table. We actually get to click on things. So we're going to get to select what column we want to sort by, and it'll reshuffle our table as we go. Now, bit of news here, we don't get fancy sorts like you would in Excel. This is extraordinarily rudimentary sorting. We can only do one column at a time, and any sort unsorts everything else. So we can't pull those fancy primary sort, secondary sort business that we can on, say, Excel. Right? But this isn't Excel. It's the GMAT. And the questions will be pretty simple. And so it won't be a big deal that we can only sort by one column. It'll be fine. Now, as we're working on these, again, each table, much like the graph, is only going to have a single question that accompanies it. Now, these are much like the questions from those MSRs. It's like the either-ors. And so you'll have, say 3 statements, and you'll have to either sort of say true or false, or I can prove it from the table, I can't prove it from the table. So kind of like inference questions from our critical reasoning and our reading comprehension. And again, the bad news, right? No partial credit. Ugh. All right, that's fine. We're getting used to this old hat, no partial credit. We're good at this now. All right, so last but not least, and actually let's just go ahead and call it last but least, my least favorite problem on the IR section, because it's just so open. It could be anything. It could be a geometry problem. It could be critical reasoning. It could be a weird logic game like on the LSATs. It could be the nastiest variable problem that you've ever worked on where all the answer choices still have variables and it's just complicated functions and the two-part analysis. So it's got a boring little name, two-part analysis. But the two-part doesn't refer to the prompt information. The two-part refers to the question. So when we're working on these, we'll just be given some sort of story. Maybe it's a bunch of information about a critical reasoning argument or something that looks a lot like a critical reasoning argument. Maybe it's the setup for a weird logic game. Maybe it's all of the information, all of the equations that I'm allowed to use to solve for a bizarre volume geometry problem. Or maybe it's a number properties problem or a related rates problem. It could be anything under the sun. And I think that's what makes these two-part analyses so hard. That and the fact that the reading alone on these can be quite intensive, and the questions are usually very complex. So you're going to be forced to do all of this, and you only get 2.5 minutes. Now, I know, MSR, lots of reading, lots of complex questions, but you get 7.5 minutes on MSR. You get the time for 3 questions on MSR. So you get to read, and then you get to barrel through a bunch of questions because you're familiar with the content. You're familiar with the tabs. In this case, you're going to get a bunch of new information, and then you're going to have to answer questions about it. And in this case, each column gets an answer. Right? So it's not that each row gets an answer anymore. It's each column. And I'm going to show you probably the only 2-part analysis, and it's this one in fact, but it's going to be the only 2-part analysis that I bother with on test day. Most of them I just ignore. And that's okay. I want it to be okay for you guys too. Now, last but not least, right, we have to say it one more time. I just have to make sure, put that little caveat out there, we don't get partial credit for this section either. So it's good to just pay attention, right? Try and do as best as we can, only sticking with those problems where we feel like we could do a good job for all of the parts. Okay, so this is our section. This is where we sit. We sit here with 10 total prompt sets, right? There's going to be 1 set of MSR, plus 2 of the tables, that's 3, plus 3 of the graphics, that's 6, and then another 4 of the 2 parts, that's 10, right? So we're going to see 10 prompts. Now, of these 10 prompts, one of them has 2 extra questions. Don't forget this MSR. So we actually get 12 different question screens. So there's 12 right or wrongs, right? Because each question is going to be either completely right or completely wrong. And whatever the prompt is will always be on the screen while we're working on any one question. So we don't have to worry about trying to memorize anything. We're just going to do our best, kind of organize information. All right, so that's the test. This is what the IR looks like. All these crazy question types. I don't know about you, but I'm ready to start understanding the scoring and figuring out how to use my understanding of the score and my understanding of these question types to do a better job and to be lazy, because I am a lazy test taker. And from here on out, I want you to be lazy test takers. Okay? I want you to look for the easy, lazy shortcut, not the trap, the lazy, easy, good math. All right, so it's time to talk about the score. Okay? How is this test scored? Not just what is the score, great, it's 1 to 8, but how? How many questions do we have to get right? It's not adaptive. Okay? It's not an adaptive test, not this little section. Okay? It is going to move forward, can't go back and bounce around, but I don't have to worry about questions getting harder or easier based on how I'm doing. So how can I think about the score? Well, we actually did some experiments and we sort of pestered the folks over at GMAC, and we started looking over the GMAT Prep, the new 2.0 version. And through all of these things, we came up with some pretty interesting findings. Now, what we started to notice was that there was some grouping happening. So let me kind of explain to you what this chart is saying. Right? So here are the number of questions that this test taker got completely right. And so when I say test taker, we actually set our people down in front of the GMAT Prep 2.0, right, where there's that practice integrated reasoning section that you can do and have it scored. We set our folks down in front of it, and we had them taking this test over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, intentionally getting a certain number right, a certain number wrong, right? Just trying to get a feel. How many can we get right? How many can we get wrong? What kind of scores are we looking at here? And this is what we found. We found that there's a little bit of clustering. Okay? So what is this clustering sort of telling us? Well, a few things really. One, notice the overlap. That I could miss or get 7 right, in other words, miss 5, and I could get a 5 or a 7 or anything in between. Now, I'll warn you, we couldn't make the test for whatever reason. I think it just has an issue with the number 6. It wouldn't give us a 6. But what we did see was confirmed once we spoke with folks at the GMAC, and it's that, yes, while the test is not adaptive, there are some difficulty adjustments, right? So some questions are in fact going to be considered harder than others. And it's not necessarily a specific type of question. It's just maybe some two parts are more difficult than others, or maybe some graphs are more complicated. I definitely can stand by the fact that some of the weird graphs are more complicated. And if it's a standard graph, pie chart that we're used to seeing, right, scatter plot, whatever, those are fine. But when it's the weird timelines or flow charts, so those can be a little bit more difficult. So there is some difficulty adjustment. That's why there's overlap vertically. But what about all of this? Oh man, I can miss 3, 4 questions and still get a 7 or an 8. That's a perfect score in IR. So what does that mean? It means that there's a little bit of forgiveness, that you don't actually have to get every question right to get a perfect score. Even better news when we don't really care about a perfect score, right? So this is all very, very exciting news because we don't want to have to stress about this section. Right? I've got other things to stress about. I've got the rest of the GMAT to stress about. I don't want to stress about this. So let's look at the new scores. So scores are released from the GMAC on their website, gmac.com, on the first of every month, and they've been released since they've been doing this since August. Because the test is so new, they have to wait for a new cohort to come in and constantly readjust and constantly readjust and constantly readjust. Now, it's true, the scores are going up month after month, but only slightly. Okay, so I don't want anybody to panic that, oh man, I should have taken it at the beginning when the percentiles were easier to achieve. No, they're not going up so drastically that you need to be concerned. If we take a look at the percentile rankings at each number, a couple of interesting things pop up. One is that a 52nd percentile, right, this sort of middle of the road bit, is a 5. Huh. Looks like I can miss almost half the questions and maybe still get a 5. So if I'm just trying to break even, if I'm just trying to get over the halfway point, then I'm okay. Right? That's all right. I actually don't have to work nearly as hard as maybe I thought. Another interesting thing is the distribution of these. Notice that there's 13% of test takers getting between a 1 and a 2, or getting a 2 as opposed to a 1. There are then another 11% that get the 3 over the 2, and then 14% that get the 4, and then another 14, and it's really flat. Now, this is very flat. This is a much flatter distribution than the rest of the test. Right? So it's very evenly spread across numbers. Now, what that means for you while you're taking the section, I wouldn't worry about it. But the idea is that this isn't really shaping up to look like a normal distribution yet. It's not really shaping up to have this nice smooth bell curve because there's not a lot of cut points here and there's not a lot of questions. So, all right, these are the percentiles. I would not, and I stress would not, be worried about an 8. In fact, all I'm really worried about is kind of breaking even, getting over the mean. That's all when I'm taking this section, that's all I really care about is breaking the mean. And again, this mean and these percentiles are updated as of November 1st of 2012. So make sure that you're checking GMAC's website at gmac.com or searching for integrated reasoning, GMAC scores, and that way you can see the most up-to-date scores for you and for your test. But again, what does this mean? Well, whatever you see when you go look to see what the most up-to-date scores are, think to yourself, I'd like to just be a little bit over the mean, right? I'd like to be a little better than the mean. So my goal, a 5 or a 6. This phantom 6 that's apparently impossible. But let's hope that it's possible on the real test. So this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something between a 5 or a 6. And I'm fine with either of those. I'd be absolutely thrilled. And you should be too. Right? So my goal then to get a 5 or a 6 is to get somewhere between 6 and 8 questions right. That doesn't seem so bad. Seems like I can miss almost half. Now, what I'd like to do is be strategic about those ones that I'm missing and miss ones that I wouldn't have wanted to do anyways. And so that's where the rest of our work today comes from. How do we know which problems to work on? How long should we spend on those problems? And what are some ways that we can cut our time on those problems where we do invest? Okay, so let's start looking at the speed secrets for each question type. Now, within these different prompts, obviously, when the content is very different, it, it could get a little unpredictable. We can't use the same shortcuts all the time. But I want to give you some ideas about things to look out for and to be ready for. So let's start again with a quick review of all of the types that we have available. And we'll start with these longest, these multi-source reasonings. Right? So the MSRs, kind of zoom in here a little bit. MSRs, again, have this kind of big, messy part that we're going to have to read. Now, it may have tables, it may have other information in with the reading, but it's going to be quite a bit of information, right? So we'll be clicking between or among some tabs. Thankfully, the tab headings are fairly informative, so we want to use those to help us organize our thoughts as we read. And remember that you're going to have 7.5 minutes to not only handle reading, but then you'll have 2 of these one answer per row business questions and 1 of these multiple choices. So let's think about the best way to break up our time. Because at the end of the day, MSRs, while it seems like a lot, are one of the few places where you almost do have plenty of time to answer. So why don't we start, if we've got 7.5 minutes total, these guys here can take a little while. So we'd probably like to have the better part of 2 minutes to work on these. So maybe 1:45 each one. And then for our standard multiple choice, we'd probably only need about a minute and a quarter once we've actually read this argument. Right? So once we've read through all the tabs. So really, we've got a couple of minutes up front where we can spend some time reading. Now, we don't want to overanalyze. We just want to kind of read and understanding how all of the pieces fit together. That's going to be our biggest time savings because we don't really know what the questions are going to ask about. And the IR section has this tendency of giving us a lot more information than we'll need. So we certainly want to at least find where everything is. We don't want to get too bogged down because we'd like to weed out information quickly, and I don't want to have wasted a bunch of time reading it when it turns out I don't even need it. So let's start there. Let's start by kind of a brief together analyzation of, let's just analyze this little 3-tabby business, okay? So we'll have 3 tabs. The first one here is a tab about techniques. It starts to tell us some interesting stuff. Maybe it gives us some specific details or lists. Our next tab is for artifacts. Ooh, thank goodness, this one's a lot shorter, and that's often the case. It's pretty rare that all of the tabs are immensely long. So the second one, pretty short, but it is still reading, so that's kind of a blah. And then the last one, budget, ooh, even shorter. So that's pretty good. We don't have a whole lot to read. I would say that this is about on par with a reading comp passage. So we should feel pretty good being able to complete a brief read. Not even going to be reading this as in-depth as we would a reading comp passage, but feel pretty good with a scan in about 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give you guys 1.5 minutes. I want you to read through all 3 of these tabs. And the biggest thing I want you to think about is as you're scanning, I don't want you reading for every single word, but as you're scanning, I want you thinking about how the different tabs connect. Where is the overlapping information? Where are certain things repeated? And so on. So let's go ahead and take 1.5 minutes and see how we do. All right, so that's a minute and a half. Let's take a look. And where, again, really wanted you to spend your time, right? So take about a minute and a half to scan, review, make sure we know where things are. And now we're going to take another minute and think about connections, maybe 45 seconds, and think about how all these things connect, okay? So the first tab, this techniques tab, it's talking about different techniques. What kind of techniques? It seems to be, I don't know, just all sorts of different historical artifact techniques. Doesn't really go into any detail up front that they're all there to do the same thing, but they are, it seems, used in obtaining information about creation of each of these objects. Okay, so like dating them maybe? All right, so these techniques are doing some dating, and they give us four, all right, techniques for animal teeth and some fancy names, techniques for metallic ores and those fancy names, techniques for plant matter and, carbon dating, and then techniques for fired clay objects. Okay, so first page is telling us about techniques for specific types of artifacts made of specific materials. Okay, so then what next? Let me kind of keep track. What next? Well, now we move to the second tab. What's the artifacts tab doing? And I often make notes like this on my paper. T1, types of material and how they can be tested. So what's T2 doing? Well, the artifacts tab seems to be talking about, well, specific artifacts, right? Wood, to be most specific, and how to date those. Okay, so test accuracy, test dating, give us some years on wooden artifacts. Now, I already want to start noticing some connections. I mean, wooden, they never said wooden on the first one in terms of materials. But wait, they did say plant matter, and wood is plant matter, right? So that's where they're connected. And that's basically it, right? This whole section talks about wood, but it does talk about two specific test types, radiocarbon dating and this TL dating, whatever those are. And they were over here, TL and radiocarbon. Okay. Now let's move on to the third tab. Third tab just talks about a budget. Okay, the budget and how much it would cost for different tests. Okay, so our budget would equal the cost of random combinations that I really don't need to get into memorizing. I should get more interested in those if I actually get asked a question about a budget. But if not, no big deal. Right? But I do want to recognize that these tests, like this TL, radiocarbon, those things are the tests that were discussed in the other tabs. So remember, we're not going to be able to see all three tabs at the same time or both tabs at the same time if there are only two. So it's going to be our job to sort of start building this loop in our minds. Hey, what connects? What goes with what? Making our little notes. Maybe we draw the arrows between the T1s and T2s and T3s that we actually put on our paper. All right, so here's kind of the mental notes that I want you thinking about as you read. And now let's take a step back and let's work on one of the questions. So let's try the sort of one answer for each row question. All right, so let's try this together. Let me go ahead and give you 20 seconds or so to read through the question on your own, and then let's try it. All right, so be really careful with questions like this. Questions like this remind me a lot of data sufficiency in a way. It's just sort of weird how they ask them. So we want to know, we're told about some different artifacts. A bronze statue of a deer, a fired clay pot, a wooden statue of a warrior. And based on all of the information that we have in our tabs, we're trying to figure out if we can actually obtain a range of dates. If I can obtain a range of dates for its creation, then I'm going to say yes, I can. If I can't obtain or don't know if I can obtain, right? So I don't have to say no definitively. It's kind of the I don't know answer. Then I'm going to put no. And The IR section does this a lot. You have yes if you're able to prove it, and then no if you don't know, or if you can prove that it's not the right date, or kind of the catch-all category. All right, so let's go through these one by one. So we'll start by trying to find a range of dates for this bronze statue of a deer. Okay, so where could we find a bronze statue of a deer? Well, I saw bronze. That was in the metals. We saw metals, right? I don't have to worry about budget, so I can just kind of focus in over here. I can just look at these two because I don't need any budgetary information. I just need a date range. Okay, so metallic ores or alloys. Well, what do we know about those metallic ores or alloys? Well, we know what sort of dating test they use. It's this ICP-MS, inductively blah, 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 fancy words I don't want to learn. Well, were there any of these ICP-MS tests over here? Well, wait, no, there weren't. Remember, there was only radiocarbon dating, TL, and then some stuff about wood. So the only place where we knew anything about the actual dates, right, the 200 years or minus 100 years, came from a section that isn't related to the question that we have. So what does that mean? Does that mean that I know the date? No, I don't know the date. I don't know anything about the dates here. So if I don't know the dates, then that's my answer. I can't show what they are, so I would just click in no. So notice it may be a three-part question, but the parts can move fairly quickly. All right, let's try it again with a fired clay pot. So where did we learn about fired clay pots? Well, I didn't really read about pots, but I did learn about fired clay objects. Again, don't have to worry about the budget for any of these, so I can ignore this tab. So our fired clay objects use TL dating. Now hold on, TL dating was mentioned up here. And we know that they can get an accurate date within 200 years. So that means I can get a range of dates for anything that's fired clay. So if it's a fired clay pot, then yes, right? I can get this TL dating with 100 years, I'm set. So I go back and I answer this one. So I plug in my little choice for yes, I can answer for the fired clay pot. All right. So then the last of the three questions, we need to know about a wooden statue of a warrior. Okay, so can I answer this question about a range of dates? Again, don't even have to worry about this stupid budget tab, so it's nice. We want to keep remembering what tabs don't I ever have to click back to. So wooden, hey, I did some thinking about wooden, and I know both of these talk about wood, so I can probably move through this one fairly quickly. I see that we've got plant matter, which I knew was wood. I use radiocarbon dating for that. I come back over here, I see radiocarbon dating is accurate for plus or minus 200 years, so I can do that right now with the dates that they know from this little, where they've presumed this in the clay. I can now date. So this is great. I can date the wooden statue of a warrior. So I add this to my list, and my answer here is yes. And that's all. That's all we have to worry about for these weird, one answer for each row. It's not the end of the world, not too crazy, right? It just looks a little different. All right, well, what might one of the multiple choices look like? Again, why don't you take 30 seconds and read the question, and then we'll talk about it together. All right, so let's walk through this one. It's asking us about all kinds of different materials that we probably read about, right? They're talking about this wooden box, and inside the wooden box we've got a fired clay bead, and there's some sediment. In the sediment there's clay, more clay, and plant matter. So all of those things are things that were listed that I read about in techniques. So man, that's a lot of stuff I'm going to have to research. So let's make sure that we have a clear picture of what the question really wants us to find. So they're talking about the museum's assumptions, these dates over here. Which one of the details of the bead? Hold on. It's not asking about the box. It's not asking about the clay or the plant matter. It's only asking about the bead. So that's all I have to worry about, right? It's just this fired clay bead. So what do I know about a fired clay bead? I don't think it's much, actually. So all I know about fired clay objects, I've got some information down here, right, at the bottom about what sort of dating I use for them, this TL dating. And it says TL dating up here because we already used that for an earlier question. So if I have fired clay and TL dating, wait, that means I know about how to date fired clay objects. I can get a date of origin, date of their creation. So that's kind of all I know, right? I know a little bit about how much they might cost, but it's part of a bigger package deal, right? How much it would cost to test these objects. So let's see. Let's put all these little pieces together and see what I know. Well, all I really know is something about its age. So did any of these answer choices talk about age? Well, the first one, a range of dates for its manufacture, yeah, that would give me age. So that does seem like something I know. I certainly don't know what island it was made on. I have no idea about vegetation patterns near the workshop. I don't know when it was put in the box. That's really tempting though, because it's a range of dates, but I know its date when it was built or when it was created, not when it was put in the box. And I have no idea about the source of the clay because that's not related to this fired clay bead aspect and everything that I know from the passage. So that leaves us with A. So again, MSRs are one of my favorite, and the reason is because sure, there's a bunch of stuff to read in the beginning and to get used to. So yeah, you are going to need to put in some extra effort up front, and it's going to take a little extra work, but because of the fact that you can get 3 questions with that work, I think that this is a great set to focus on when remembering, hey, I only need to get 6 to 8 questions right. Why not spend a little bit of extra time, really understand the tabs, and try out 3 questions based on the same material, right? By the time you finish your second question, going into the third, you're going to be so much more comfortable with that material that you'll just be a ton more efficient. All right, so let's look at our next question type. We'll go ahead and hit over here on these graph questions. I think that in many ways, these are another question that are very easy to make your assessment, hey, should I work on this question or should I ditch this question? Right? Is this going to be one of those 6 to 8 that I'm really trying to get right? Or is this going to be one of those 4 or more that I decide, nah, I don't even really want to work on this one? Okay, so quick reminder of our graphs. The way they'll look is that we'll get a graph of some sort. Who knows what it'll look like? And then we'll have some information. They'll give us all of our axes and some labels, maybe even a title. Then we'll be given a question. It always looks like this. From each drop-down menu, select the option that creates the most accurate statement based on the information provided in the graph. So it's fill in the blank. It's complete the sentences. We can totally do that. So let's start all of these questions. So any graph question, I want you to start looking over the graph and trying to understand what information is given to you. And please do not forget the written words under the graph because often very important information is here. So it tells us about some hypothetical weights of the T-Rex, right? From the time it was born, baby T-Rex, until the time it was 30 years old. Right? And they give us some specific points. And then they tell us the corresponding points, which is nice because they don't actually seem to line up. So maybe we should note that A is at 12, because it does say respectively. So A is 12. It looks like B would be 16, and C is 20. Okay, so these are the different ages of our T-Rex. And these would be the corresponding weights in kilograms. Right? So it seems as if it's just telling us some data, right? It's basically a count or a belief that, oh, hey, if you ran across a 16-year-old Tyrannosaurus Rex, he'd weigh 3,000 kilograms. Got it, right? So each dot is sort of representing an expected weight by the thing's age, right? So A at 12 years would be, oh, I don't know, 900 kilograms. Still a pretty heavy Tyrannosaurus Rex. I would run. I would not want to hang out with this Tyrannosaurus Rex. All right, so the next piece that we're responsible for is once we figured out, okay, this is what the table is trying to ask us about, or tell us about rather, it's time to go into our questions. So let's just take a look at one of them. And I picked the harder of the two for us to work on. Let's look at the first one. Okay, so the first question asks about, for integer values of the age from 12 to 30, so up to the end of my little chart, the average or mean mass falls between, and so then to figure out what our choices are, we'd click on select, and then we'd see, oh, it's three pretty broad ranges, 2 to 3,000, 3 to 4,000, 4 to 5,000. So I'm looking for the average weight for all T-Rexes between the age of 12 and 30. Now, let's be careful, because I don't know about you, but my gut reaction here was actually to think like, hey, couldn't I just look at this and say like, oh, isn't this somewhere in the middle? Like, you know, what's between 12 and 30? Let me go find that space between 12 and 30 and go find a dot. But I don't know, maybe it's this one, maybe it's a 3,000 dot. Is it, where do I find the dot? Where would I look? And the fact is that the way our graph is drawn, we can't just find a point in the middle. Right? That's not what this problem is. It's not drawn in such a way. It's not a linear graph all the way across. So we can't just find the average by finding a point. It's got curves happening. So what do we need to think about? Well, if I was going to actually do some calculating, what I could do is I could take each age, 12 through 30, and I could find its corresponding weight. So, at 12, I would write down 900, and then I would add to that the weight at 13 years old, and that would be, I don't really know, right? I'm finding really ugly numbers that don't match up so much. And then I'd have to divide that by however many terms there are, and so that's, the difference between 30 and 12 would be 18, but then I got to count one more for those endpoints. So I've got 19 terms. So I'm going to add up a whole bunch of really messy numbers. Fine, I have a calculator. But this seems like it's going to take a really long time. And it's going to be fairly error prone because, I can't even see where 16, 17, 18, and 19 are, much less what weights correspond. So there's got to be an easier way. Right? So don't let the presence of a calculator push you into using the calculator for everything. So let's take a look at our graph. Is there any way that we could kind of lump values together and make our lives easier so we don't have to do quite so much work? And the answer is yes, right? So look at all these values up here above 20. All the T-Rexes above 20 kind of weigh the same thing. So it's as if I could treat those all as the same weight. So it would be like having 10 different, 9, 10 different ages all weighing, oh, I don't know, whatever this is, 5,500, something in there. If I could group things together before I find an average, I'm solving weighted averages. So could I do a weighted average for this entire thing? Well, sure, right? So the harder one, I think, we can all sort of see that this line up here is pretty flat. It's got a little bit of a hump, but by the time I've gone up to 21, we're almost in a flat line up here. So the difficult part is going to be this 12 to 20 business. And although it's not horizontally flat, it is fairly linear. And so if I have a line, the average would just be the middle point on that line. Because think about it. Let's say we draw a line from A to C, right? And B's in the middle. For every value below B, there's a corresponding value above B that's just as big, and it's got the same slope. So if I go down 1 year, I go just as far away from B as if I went up 1 year. And so they cancel each other out. And so if I take all the ages from 12 to 20, I can estimate those to be about 3,000. And then I can say, hey, well, how many years are there from 12 to 20? That's about 9 years. Okay. We can then go and take the years 21 through 30, estimate those at that 5,500 we were talking about, and say, okay, well, that's the other 10 So that means that's everybody. That's all 19 of those ages. So I build this as a weighted average. I take 3,000 and I multiply by 9. And then I take 5,500 and I multiply it by 10. This is where I'm going to pull out the calculator. And I'm certainly going to use a calculator now. 3,000 times 9. I'm going to plug 3,000 times 9 in my calculator. And then I'm going to say, well, 5,500 times 10 just adds another 0. So rather than clearing out my math from 3,000 times 9, I'm just going to immediately add 5500 and add one more 0 there. So I get 82,000. Okay, now what do I do with 82,000? Well, I'm going to break out the calculator again because I still have to do my average portion and divide by 19. So 82,000 divided by 19 is some really ugly number, 4,215.789. But guess what? All I care about is that that number is in one of my ranges. It's in this range right here. So that's my answer. I select it, I filled in my blank, I'm all done. So graphs are really straightforward. The biggest hiccup is trying to understand what the graph is telling you and being very careful not to make crazy assumptions. Right? So try and take time doing two things on these problems. Right? One, make sure that you actually understand what's going on the graph. If you need to, actually tell yourself a little story. Okay, so each dot, what does each dot mean? What does each bar mean? What does each line mean? And then when you're asked a question, ask yourself, wait a minute, is that really that easy? Does that make sense that I'm allowed to do it that way? Or would I need to actually, spend a little bit of time thinking about what the average of these numbers could mean? And for every question on the IR section, be judicious. Don't add up 19 terms just to divide them. Think about ways of lumping terms together as a shortcut. Awesome. All right, so what's the rule then for graph problems? Think before you calculate. Make sure you understand the graph, make sure you understand what the question's asking, and make sure you've looked for any shortcuts so you don't have to do a bunch of punching into your little on-screen calculator. If you do this, then graphs are going to be a big friend of yours on test day. All right, so let's move to tables. I love some tables, so this will be a fun little section to look at. So what's the deal with tables? What do we have to think about when it comes to tables? Well, we think about the fact that we can sort. And we can sort when we use tables all the time, but it's going to be very simple sort. Again, right? It's not going to be a complicated sort. We want to make sure that we are sorting, though, to save us some time. So let's take a look at this graph. Right, the graph is giving us some Brazilian agricultural data. Okay, and it's giving us stuff on different commodities, different food items, and they're talking about production and exports, both Brazil's percent of world as well as their rank in the world. Okay, so little note to self, I'm looking at Brazil's portion of the world production and exports for a bunch of stuff. Good enough. I get what this table's talking about. Shouldn't take me more than 20, 30 seconds to understand the big picture of the table. I'm paying attention. Hey, look at the names. Yeah, okay, all of these are different. Ooh, but look, there's some repeats, right? I've got some repeated rating for these rankings, right? So it seems to me that Brazil's #1 in a lot of scenarios. Okay, so that might be good to hang on to, good to recognize. All right, so now let's go with our question. So we're going to go through in much the same way that we did on the MSR, and we'll go one by one. And what we're trying to show is, hey, can I show that the statement is true? Or is it false? Or do I have absent information? So be very careful. Yes means true. No means everything else. So no would mean false, and I have no idea. All right, so the first question is asking us about this business of no individual country produces more than 1/4 of the world's sugar. So I want to think about how I could rewrite that and make it make more sense to me. So really in my mind, I'm just thinking, okay, no single country, I can use some math. If for no country, will productivity be greater than 25% in the sugar column? Well, this seems a little bit strange. Like, how am I going to know this? Because all I know about is Brazil. So I might have to get creative. That seems too obvious to just say, well, I only know about Brazil. I can't know about any other country. So let's go take a look at Brazil. Okay, so I'm looking for sugar. Brazil has 21% of the world's share. So Brazil certainly doesn't have more than 25%. So how in the world could I possibly know? If Brazil doesn't have more than 21%, how could I know if anyone else does? I can't. But wait a minute. I can look at their rankings. Right? I can see, hey, where is, right, like where is Brazil in relation to everybody else in the world? Take a look. Brazil produces and exports the most. So if Brazil is producing the most and it only produces 21% of the world's share, then nobody else out there can beat Brazil's share. So nobody else out there could have more than 25%. So I know for a fact that no other country could produce more than 25% of the world's sugar. I can plug in that, yes, I actually do know this one. Not bad. Okay? The next question says if Brazil produces less than 20%. So I've got if-then statements, and these are very common. So I want to make sure I know what the two pieces are. So I'm going to go look and find out any produce where Brazil is actually producing less than 20%. And then I want to know, do they, in all of these cases, have an export ranking of less than 1? Because it tells me if they produce less than 20%, then they can't be the top exporter. So if production is less than 20%, then is their export less than 1? Okay, so come back. Let's take a look. Well, how am I going to figure out where their production is less than 20%? Well, I need production as a percent. It's time to use our sort. So what do? I click on the sort. It brings down my menu. I pick production world share percent. Right? Click on that, and now I've sorted. Notice that nothing else is sorted. Everything else sort of sorts or unsorts itself. So this is my production world share. So where is production less than 20%? Okay, well that's this range. Now all I want to do is compare pork, cotton, corn, chicken, and beef across to the export ranking. In all of these cases, is export ranking less than 1? No, it's not. In 2 cases, we have an export ranking that is first. That means that this is false. This statement is not true. And so since it's not true, I can say no. Because remember, no is for not true or I have no idea. All right, last but not least, of the commodities in the table for which Brazil ranks first. Okay, so if, right, their export ranking is first, so it's number 1, then Brazil produces more than 20% of the world supply. So I'm looking for proof that if export ranking is 1, then production is greater than 20. So let's go see if I find that. Is it true that if export ranking is 1? Well, what do I need to do? Well, I need to rank based on exports. So again, I'm coming back up to my tab. I'm going to click on it. I'm going to find my exports, this world rank. Once I click on that, I'm sorted over here. I've got 5 different commodities that are ranked number 1 from Brazil. That's pretty great for Brazil, at least. So I'm looking for orange juice, coffee, sugar, beef, and chicken. And I'm checking their production share. So it's these rows. Now, is production always greater than 20% for all of these number 1s? No, there's 2 again that are not as predicted. So if they're not as predicted, the answer is no. And so I can say no. Now notice that almost all of these, well actually they all, dealt with the production column. And then the last 2 that had a little bit more work to be done dealt with the same 2 columns, exporting and production. And that's really typical. And so for these table problems, you can often shave off time because each of the multi-parts are asking about the same information. So it really does pay to spend a little bit of time up front making sure that you understand the table. Because tables are pretty easy to take a look at. I mean, you've seen tables all your life. So you know how to read a table. So take some extra time, unless the table is just absolutely insanely massive and you just don't even know how to handle it. Take some time reading about the table, and then I would leave these in your, yep, I should do these kind of problems because I think they're probably a little bit easier and they're definitely faster. All right, so this leaves us with the ugly problem, right? The last little piece, and it's the two-parter. So before we get there, remember, table analysis, Think about sorting to make things faster, making sure that you understand the table. Maybe sort the table a few times just to understand what it's talking about. These guys, speedy little problems, so definitely worth keeping on the list. So 2 parts. Oy, the devil in all the details. 2-parters have, again, the information that you're going to read, and then you're going to answer the 1 question per column. It's a 2-part question. It's the only one that's like this. So let's do this exact problem, because I'll be honest, this is really the only 2-part problem I'll do. If a 2-part problem is verbal, I almost always skip it. If a 2-part problem is really, really ugly, complicated math with crazy formulas, and the answer choices have big, ugly formulas, or the answer choices have variables in them, I'll give it about 30 seconds max to decide if I want to work on it, and then I dump them. So the only 2-part problems that I actually really enjoy doing and I feel can be completed quickly are when you have a relationship, a direct relationship between the 2 items that you're solving for. Right? So organization A and organization B, a fairly short bit of information and simple number answers. So what I'll do, right, is read through our information. So let's do that together. Let's read through this. I want to give you 30 seconds to read through this and make sure you understand what it is that we know. All right, so we've read a bit about the story. We see that we're talking about 2 different organizations. One is smaller than the other, but after 5 years of growing, it's actually going to meet and surpass this size. Okay. They talk about constant rates, and then when I get down here into the question itself, it starts to talk about, hey, in the table, identify a rate of increase in terms of members per year and a rate of increase in terms of members per year. So I'm comparing organization A with organization B, and they're kind of jointly defined. So these are my kind of questions. These are the questions that you can actually finish relatively quickly. So it may seem, rate of increase, that it's going to be this complicated rate problem, but as soon as I know that A and B are not just related, but on top of being related, they're co-defined. So their rates are being defined because one is going to catch up to the other. So they're going to have a specific relationship between their rates. That's going to give me a much easier way to solve, because the rule here is that I don't actually need to know the answer. I don't actually have to solve for the answer. All I need to come up with quickly is a relationship, right? So I can find any relationship between A and B, and that'll help me choose from answer choices. And it always works. Okay? So let's think about the details. What I know from the story is that in 5 years, A is going to catch up to B. Okay, so A is going to catch up to B. And how much is that? Well, they're going to have to catch up, well, that's only 500 members. So they're going to have to catch up 500 members in 5 years. Okay, so if A has to catch up 500 members in 5 years, right, members per year, hold on, members per year. If I could turn this into 1 year, this is a rate. Members per year is a rate. So if I have 500 members in 5 years, then that's the same as saying 100 members per 1 year. And so now I've got the rate in the form I want it. So all I need is I need 2 choices where their rates are different by 100 members per year, because that difference is what A has to catch up. Okay? So which answer choices are 100 apart? Well, there's no 110, oh, there's a 130, and there's no 140, so it must be 30 and 130. And now which of these two is growing at a faster rate? Well, I know that A must be growing at a faster rate. So this must be A, and then this must be B. And that's all. And I'm done. And now you might be able to see why these are probably the only two-parters I'll work on. Because the verbal ones can get huge. Imagine them as just giant critical reasoning, because it's not just a giant critical reasoning passage, but you also have to answer two in-depth critical reasoning problems, like which would strengthen, which would weaken, which would be a conclusion, which would be a way to explain the conclusion. They are very complicated, extremely complicated. So my rule of thumb for two-parters is primarily beware, right? I tend to avoid these. There's 4 of them. I try to capture one of them, by using one of the easier math problems that I see, or if it's a very short verbal problem. But if it's anything weird, I'm probably going to ditch it, right? So it's going to be in my super speedy ditch pile. So let's do that then. Let's get our last and final speed strategy together. Okay, how are we going to handle this as an entire section? Now that we've got some ideas about how to handle each specific question, let's think about them all together. Okay, so thinking about these types all in one section together, it might be a good idea to remind ourselves what it is that our goal is, right? Our goal is to get through this thing as painlessly as possible because we have the rest of the test that matters, right? So we really don't care about being the best. We just want to get, a 5 or a 6. That means we need between 6 and 8. We don't necessarily want to be so risky that we say we're only going to try on 6, because I know for me personally, if I do 6 problems, it's probably not likely that I'm going to get all 6 of them right. So I should give myself some room, maybe try 8 or 9. But what that does is it gives me a set number, maybe 3 or 4 problems that I feel very comfortable just dumping on my way through the test, because I know they're either going to make me stressed out, or they're going to be hard, they're going to take too long, or all of the above. Right? So let's go through each question type and make sure that we're clear about how we might handle them. Now, these are how I would handle them and how I might recommend a typical student should handle them. But let's say you're really good at one of the topics that I think are crummy. Then put those on your keep list and throw something else to the wolves. Right? So maybe you think, Whitney, you're crazy. Tables are awful. Or, oh, those MSRs, they're killing me. But remember, if you're going to dump something like an MSR, I want to caution you, because that you're dumping all 3 of your freebies in one fell swoop. That means you're stuck with everything else. So unless that MSR is so awful, all right, I just want you to give it a shot. Yes, it takes some extra effort up front, right? Yes, there's lots of information. Yes, you have to flip between all these tabs, but there's a lot of value here. Right? You're getting to answer 3 questions kind of at the price of 1. So you only have to analyze the information of one large question, and you get to get 3 questions because of it. And it might seem like a big, giant effort, but you're going to be faster overall. You'll be faster once you've moved off the information gathering stage and into the question answering stage. So my verdict, these would be questions that I would say stick with them, but take your time. Right? 7.5 minutes is actually a long time to work on an MSR. You should have plenty of time for these. Now, I want you to think about problems in terms of, here's my keep bank, this is my little keep piggy bank, and this is my dump recycle bin. It's time to put them out and hope someone else can make something nice out of them. So I would keep my MSR, and so I would be keeping all 3 questions that go with my MSR. So I'm going to put those in my piggy bank. Well, now what happens, right? Let's say I move on to the graphics questions. Well, I told you my opinions about graphics. Sure. Unfamiliar graphics. So anytime you've got an unfamiliar graph, those can take a while, right? So that would be the one caveat to graphs, would be those ones that just you've never used before, you've never seen before, you're not sure how to read. But assuming it's a graph that looks anything like something you've seen before, just be careful of any tricks they might try and play on your eyes. But stick with it, because any familiar graphs are typically very fast, at least to understand and interpret, and you have more time to spend on the questions. And there's so many ways on graphs that you can gain speed by not calculating. or not doing every single calculation. And this is true throughout the test, okay, throughout the IR particularly. So anytime you've got bunches of numbers, and like tables are a great example, and it seems like they want you to add and then find the average of 47 numbers. Could you eyeball it? Could you sort and maybe guess? Could you look at the graph and lump them together in the way that we did? So always be looking for these, not calculating or not calculating everything speed shortcuts. So the verdict for graphs, I would say stick with familiar ones, right? Plan an approach. Make sure that you're thinking, wait, do I really want to add up all these numbers when it might be easier to group them together? And sure, throw in your own little caveat. Maybe you want to skip any of the particularly confusing graphs. So I would say this would add another 2 to my piggy bank, and I'll say 1 graph I don't mind dumping. So I'm up to 5 keeps and 1 dump. 1 more, and I'm at sort of the edge of my needs if I think I'm going to get everything right. Okay, so the tables. Well, we know how I feel about the tables. I mean, I think in general, yeah, some of them can be pretty big. You may have this feeling that you have to sort and resort, but big deal. We're used to using tables. We know how to sort tables. My goodness, I can't tell you how often I have to use Excel. I assume you guys are all in the same boat, right? The computations are so minimal, and the fact that I'm familiar with Excel and sorting and reading data out of a table really means that my verdict here is to stick with these. So these 2 table analysis problems are going to be the thing that kind of kick me over into my, all right, I have enough that if I get them all right, I can get exactly the score I want, right? Or maybe even a tiny bit higher. Now, what would I do for a buffer if I wanted to get up closer to 8 or 9? Right? Because I mean, I'm going to be left with having to deal with those 2-parters. And I don't love 2-parters. You guys know I don't love 2-parters. I've said it a lot now. They're giant time drains. For most of them, they're very long. They're often extraordinarily complicated problems. Imagine having to do 2 critical reasoning problems in 2.5 minutes, the time normally allotted for 1. Right? So they're very, very time intensive, and there's just so much to read that I only work with a handful of, some of those. If the quant looks really easy, or if it's one of these, hey, the 2 variables are related, I don't actually need to get a value, I can just try and find the relationship problems. My verdict for these is to be extraordinarily selective about which ones you keep, and I would skip most of the verbal and probably any of the lengthy quant. Right? So I'd put at least 3 of these on the chopping block for test day. So that would mean that they would add in to my trash pile. One of them, I'll try and do one of them that adds to my total of 8. And there it is. I've got it now. I have the 6 to 8 that I wanted to get right. I'm good enough getting 6 right. I'll just try 8. More than happy. Right? And that'll get me the score that I need. Now, again, do what's right for you. Find the best of your strengths and minimize the worst of your weaknesses. For me, I want to build my 8 to 9 strong, solid questions from the multi-source, from the tables, and from familiar graphs, as well as maybe those related variable 2-parters. I'm going to build those 3 to 4 that I trash out of the verbal 2-parters, any of the complicated quant 2-parters, and any unfamiliar graph I see, like a graph that looks too miserable to do. It is very unlikely that you'll have time to finish all 12 prompts in 30 minutes. So go in planning what you're going to skip, right? Time is precious. If you know your strengths and you know your strengths and your skips ahead of time, then you're gold. Okay? You'll be fine. You don't have to be stressed out during the exam trying to think, well, what should I skip? What should I work on? Maybe I have to read them all. Nope, you've got a plan. You're ready, and you'll do a great job. I want to wish you the best of luck with your test, and thanks so much for spending some time with me and Manhattan GMAT and GMAT Club to work on some integrated reasoning today. Take care.